She walked into a room full of dangerous men. Not for herself. For the sister they were about to take. 19 years old. No weapon. No lawyer. No backup. Just a girl in worn sneakers and a second-hand coat, pushing through a door she had no business opening. Into a room where the wrong word could end everything. And at the head of that table, Chairman Yoon Sung-hyun, 53 years old. Still. Controlled. A man who didn't need to raise his voice. Every person in that room already understood what he was capable of. He looked up slowly when the door opened. And Temi, trembling, breathless, heart hammering so loud she could feel it in her teeth, looked straight back at him. She didn't look away. It was desperation wearing the face of love. And she had maybe 60 seconds before the men in that room decided what to do with her. Temi and Toby Balogun were born 7 minutes apart in Lagos, Nigeria. Identical. Inseparable. Twins who finished each other's sentences before the other person knew they'd started one. They were 12 years old when their parents died. A road accident on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. A rainy night. A truck that came from nowhere. And just like that, 2 little girls went from having everything that mattered to having almost nothing at all. Their father's sister, Mrs. Balogun, stepped in. No hesitation. She was already living in Seoul, in the Itaewon district, running a small seamstress business out of a space barely big enough to be called a shop. She sent for the girls, filed the paperwork, and made room in her apartment. A 2-room flat on the 4th floor of a building where the elevator hadn't worked in 3 years. It wasn't much, but she made it feel like something. She never talked about what she had given up to make room for them. She never made them feel like a burden. That was its own kind of love. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that simply rearranges itself around whoever needs it and gets on with things. Seoul is a city that glitters. And when you are 12 and grieving and far from everything familiar, that glitter can feel both beautiful and cruel at the same time. The twins grew up watching that city from a window that didn't quite shut all the way in winter. They grew up sharing a blanket, studying under a single lamp because Mrs. Balogun kept the other lights off after 9 to manage the electricity bill. They grew up eating whatever was left after their aunt had eaten. And some months, there wasn't much left for anyone. But they were together. And for a long time, together was enough. Temi was the bold one. The one who argued with teachers when she thought they were wrong. Who navigated the city like she owned it. Who learned Korean faster than anyone expected because she refused to be someone people talked around. She was the one who made noise, so her sister didn't have to. Toby was quieter. Precise. The kind of person who read medical textbooks for pleasure and remembered everything she read. She wanted to be a doctor. Not someday vaguely, she had a plan. A specific school. A specific program. A specific year. She had written it all down in a notebook she kept under her pillow. 2 girls. 1 dream between them. And an aunt who worked herself to the bone to hold the floor underneath them. Then, 2 years ago, Mrs. Balogun collapsed in her shop. Kidney disease. Advanced. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already taken more than it had any right to. The treatment costs came back, and they were catastrophic. Mrs. Balogun told the girls not to worry. She said it the way parents say it when they are terrified. Toby heard what her aunt wasn't saying. And quietly, without telling Temi, without telling anyone, she started looking for work. Any work. Whatever it took. She was trying to save the woman who had saved them. That's all she was trying to do. That one decision put her directly in the path of Chairman Yoon Sung-hyun. The ad was 3 lines long. Restaurant hostess. Flexible hours. Good pay. No experience necessary. 3 lines. That's all it took. Toby found it on a community board. The kind of physical notice board outside a convenience store in Itaewon where people pin job offers, language exchange requests, and apartment listings. She took a photo of it with her phone. She didn't tell Temi. She didn't tell her aunt. She just called the number, arranged a meeting, and went alone. The man who met her called himself Manager Suk. He was well dressed. Precise in the way that some people mistake for professionalism. He smiled often, said all the right things, told Toby she was exactly what they were looking for: smart, presentable, hardworking. He said the restaurant valued its staff. Said the pay would cover her aunt's first month of treatment with room left over. He slid a contract across the table. It was written entirely in Korean. Toby's Korean was functional. Enough for school, enough for daily life. But legal Korean is a different language inside the language. Dense, technical, deliberate in its complexity. She read what she could. Asked about 2 clauses she didn't understand. Manager Suk waved his hand and said they were standard. Formalities. Everyone signs them. She signed it. She started 3 days later. And within the first week, the shape of what she had walked into began to show itself. The restaurant was real: tables, food, customers. But it was also something else. The hours were longer than anything discussed. The work was harder. And when Toby asked about her first payment, Manager Suk sat her down and explained, with that same calm, unbothered tone, that she wouldn't be receiving a salary yet. She owed training fees. 6 months of them. It was in the contract. Clause 7. The one she hadn't fully understood. The one he'd told her was a formality. Toby asked to leave. Manager Suk slid the contract back across the table and pointed to Clause 11. Termination before the training period ended would require full repayment of all fees up front. A number so large it would have taken her aunt 3 years to earn it. She was 19 years old, in a room with a man who had done this before, and she understood, with a coldness that settled into her chest, that she had been caught, not grabbed, not forced. Caught, the way a trap works. You don't feel it close until it already has. His cruelty was the administrative kind, the kind that operates through paperwork and policy, that leaves no bruises because it doesn't need to. He was the kind of person who understood that control dressed up as procedure is almost impossible to fight. He told Toby she was free to use her phone, free to come and go during off hours, free to talk to anyone she liked, because he knew that none of that would help her. But he underestimated one thing. He underestimated Temi. Toby called her sister on a Tuesday night. Late. Temi could hear it immediately. The way Toby's voice had gone flat and careful. The way she was choosing words like someone who knew they might be overheard. She whispered. She gave Temi the name of the restaurant. She started to say something else. The line cut. Temi called back 4 times. Nothing. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she went to the police. The officer at the front desk listened. He took notes. He asked for the contract. Temi didn't have a copy. He asked for the restaurant's address. She gave it. He looked at his notes for a moment and then looked back up at her and said in the tone of a man who had already decided, "These things take time. If there's no physical harm, it becomes a civil matter. You'd need a lawyer." He slid a printed sheet across the desk. A list of legal aid contacts. He had it ready. Pre-printed. Which meant she was not the first person to sit in that chair and describe something like this. Which meant he had handed that sheet to other people and sent them home and gone back to his desk. Which meant the sheet was the end of it, as far as he was concerned. Temi took the sheet. She did not say anything. She walked out. She stood on the pavement outside the police station, in the cold, and looked at the list in her hand. Legal aid contacts. Numbers to call. Processes to begin. Timelines measured in months. And somewhere in that restaurant, Toby was moving between tables in a uniform she hadn't chosen, and time was the one thing they didn't have. Temi stood there for a long moment. She was 19 years old. She had no money, no lawyer, no leverage, and no plan. She had a list of phone numbers and a sister and a sick aunt who didn't know any of this was happening. She thought about going home, about making tea and sitting with her aunt and telling herself that the right channels would work, that patience was a virtue, that the system existed for a reason. She thought about it seriously, for about 30 seconds. Then she folded the list once, put it in her pocket, and started walking. That evening, she started asking questions in the neighborhood. Quietly, carefully. She asked the woman at the dry goods shop. She asked the man who repaired phones 2 doors down. She asked an older woman who had lived in Itaewon for 20 years and knew everything about everyone. Every single one of them reacted the same way when she said the restaurant's name. A pause. A slight shift in the eyes. A lowering of the voice. And then the name came. Chairman Yoon Sung-hyun. The older woman who had lived in Itaewon for 20 years said it last, and quietly, and did not say it again. Temi asked what the name meant. The woman looked at her for a moment before answering. The way people look at someone who is standing at the edge of something without knowing it. Then she told her. Yoon had come up from Busan, Port District, the kind of neighborhood where the smell of salt water and diesel never quite left your clothes. He had started running errands for dangerous men at 15. By 30 he had built something that the people around him struggled to categorize. Part legitimate enterprise, part shadow network, all of it held together by one thing. His discipline. Not his violence. His discipline. He understood something Suk had only imitated. That the most durable power leaves no visible seam between the legitimate and the not. By the time he relocated to Seoul, he was operating 14 businesses. Some of them were exactly what they appeared to be. Others were not. And the lines between them were drawn so carefully that even people who were looking struggled to find where the legitimate ended and the rest began. He had a reputation that functioned as its own security system. And he had one rule, known throughout his organization, understood by everyone in his orbit. No one interrupts a private meeting. The rule had never been broken. Not once. Not in 15 years. The older woman finished speaking. She did not ask Temi what she was planning to do with the information. She already knew. She simply said, "Be careful." Temi nodded. Then she went home and started making calls. She found out on a Thursday evening. By Saturday night, she had a location. By Sunday, she was at the door. At every private meeting, on the desk his aides used against the wall of the dining room, there was a single framed photograph. A young woman, early 20s, bright eyes, a smile that looked like it had come easily to her, naturally, without effort. People who had been in those meetings noticed it. None of them asked about it. You didn't ask Chairman Yoon personal questions. That was simply understood. But the photograph was always there, always in the same position, always facing him. A man who had stripped away every visible softness, who had built a life around control and deliberate distance from sentiment, kept one photograph where he could see it. Just one. People who had worked near him, not for him, near him, described the same thing when they tried to explain what made him different from others in his world. He was quiet, not shy, not restrained, quiet in the way that some spaces are quiet, where the absence of sound is itself a kind of pressure. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was measured, exact. He did not repeat himself. He did not need to. His eyes, people said, were the thing you remembered. Not cold exactly. Observant. The kind of eyes that catalogued everything and returned nothing. That took in a room, a person, a situation, and gave you no indication whatsoever of what was being processed behind them. That was the man Temi was walking toward. That was the room she was going to enter. And somewhere inside it, her sister was still moving between tables. Still wearing a uniform she hadn't chosen. Still waiting for someone to come. She had 48 hours. That's all she gave herself. 48 hours before Suk moved Toby to a second location, which was what the woman at the dry goods shop had told her happened when workers caused problems. Once that happened, finding her again would be close to impossible. Temi was not connected. She had no money to offer, no leverage to trade, no name to drop that would open any door in that world. She started with the neighborhood. Then she went wider. She called every person she had ever done a favor for in 4 years of living in Seoul. Old classmates. A woman she had helped move apartments. A boy from her Korean language course who now worked in hospitality. A man who drove a delivery van and knew every private restaurant in the city by its back entrance. She was specific. She didn't ask about Yoon directly. She was smarter than that. She asked about the restaurant. About private bookings. About which nights the back rooms were sealed off and the regular staff were sent home early. By Saturday afternoon, she had one name. By Saturday evening, she had one address. By Sunday night, she was standing outside a building she had no business being near, in worn sneakers and a second-hand coat, with no weapon, no lawyer, and no plan that could survive contact with reality. What she had instead was simpler than any plan. She had Toby, and that was the only reason she needed. The first guard was stationed at the side entrance, a service door that the delivery drivers used. Temmie had borrowed a thermal bag from the boy she knew in hospitality. She walked up to the door with it held in both hands, head slightly down, moving with the specific purposeful energy of someone who had somewhere to be and no time to be stopped. The guard held out his hand for documentation. She said in Korean that it was a late order. Private dining. Urgent. He looked at the bag, looked at her, let her through. She had approximately 90 seconds before anyone looked twice. She didn't get 90 seconds. The second guard was inside the corridor, posted at the turn that led toward the private dining room. He saw her immediately, knew she didn't belong. His hand was on her arm before she could say a word, the thermal bag dropping from her hands and hitting the floor between them, and he was already moving her back toward the exit, efficiently, quietly, the way people in that profession are trained to handle disruptions without creating scenes. Temmie didn't fight him. She knew fighting was useless. But as he turned her toward the door, the corridor bent, and through the open service hatch at the bend, propped for ventilation, she caught a glimpse, and she stopped breathing. Toby was on the other side of that hatch, in a server's uniform, moving between tables with a tray, head slightly down, shoulders carrying the particular weight of someone who has started to accept something they should never have had to accept. Her eyes, and Temmie knew those eyes better than she knew her own, were hollow, distant. The light that was always in them, that quick, precise brightness that came from a girl who read medical textbooks for pleasure and had a plan written in a notebook under her pillow. That light was dim. Toby looked like someone who had started to forget who she was before she walked through that door. And something in Temmie, something past strategy, past caution, past every reasonable instinct she possessed, broke open. She screamed her sister's name. Not a whisper, not a controlled appeal. A scream, raw, full, the kind of sound that comes from the part of a person that exists before language and reasoning and fear. Toby. The corridor went still. The guard froze. And through the hatch, Toby's head snapped up. In the private dining room, 12 men sat around a table worth more than most people's apartments. And every single one of them turned toward the sound. The room went completely silent. Chairman Yoon Sung-hyun, who had been in the middle of a sentence, stopped speaking. He did not turn his head immediately. He set down the document he was holding. He took one measured breath. And then, slowly, with the specific, unhurried deliberateness of a man who had never once acted out of reflex in his adult life, he turned toward the disturbance. The guard had Temmie by the arm. She had stopped struggling. She was standing straight, chin up, looking directly through the service hatch into the room, looking directly at him. Yoon studied her for a moment. This girl, worn sneakers, second-hand coat, hands that were visibly shaking, and yet a gaze that was not. He raised one hand. Just one, barely a gesture. The guard released her arm immediately and stepped back. The room held its breath. Yoon spoke 2 words in Korean. Quiet. Absolute. Bring her in. Temmie walked through that door and stood at the end of a table lined with men who had, between them, seen and done things she could not fully imagine. Men who operated in a world where a wrong word had consequences that paperwork could not fix. Every nerve in her body told her to run. Her legs told her to run. The cold, clear, animal part of her brain that existed only to keep her alive told her, with some urgency, to run. She stood still, because on the other side of that hatch, her sister was watching. And Temmie had not come this far to run. Chairman Yoon looked at her across the length of that table. His expression gave away nothing. His voice, when he spoke, was even, measured. You have 30 seconds, he said in Korean. Use them. Temmie opened her mouth. And what came out of it? Nobody in that room was prepared for. She had practiced the words for 6 hours straight. In the bathroom of her apartment, in front of a cracked mirror, speaking quietly so her sick aunt wouldn't hear through the wall. Korean that she knew well enough to live in. But not well enough, she feared, for this. Not for a room like that. Not for a man like him. She practiced until the words stopped feeling foreign in her mouth. And then she walked in and said them anyway. She had 30 seconds. She had practiced for 6 hours. She used every word. Temi did not beg. That is the thing that stunned the room before she had finished her second sentence. Everyone in that space, every man at that table who had seen people brought before Chairman Yoon in moments of desperation, knew what desperation looked like. It looked like trembling. It looked like pleading. It looked like people making themselves small and hoping that smallness would be mistaken for harmlessness. Temi stood at the end of that table and did none of those things. She looked directly at Yoon and she spoke. Her Korean was imperfect. The grammar stumbled in places. The tones were not always right. And she could hear that. She could hear every stumble, every syllable that landed slightly wrong. The way you can always hear your own mistakes louder than anyone else in the room. She had practiced for 6 hours. She had practiced until the words stopped feeling foreign. And still, standing here, they felt foreign. She said them anyway, because the alternative was silence. And silence meant Toby stayed. She said her sister's name. She said how old Toby was now. And then she said how old Toby had been when manager Suk first approached her with that job listing. 17 years old. She let that land. Then she continued. She said the contract had been presented in a language her sister could not fully read, that the clauses had been described as formalities, that the debt attached to leaving had never been disclosed in terms a person without legal training could understand. She said her aunt was in a hospital bed fighting for her life, and that Toby was the only family she had left, and that Toby had walked into that building trying to save the woman who had saved them both. And then, and this is the part that changed the temperature of the room, she stopped making her case and looked directly at Yoon and said, in Korean that was imperfect but completely, devastatingly clear, I am not asking you to be kind. I am asking you to be correct. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. 12 men at a table. Not one of them moved. And then manager Suk, who had been standing near the far wall, who had gone very still the moment Temi started speaking, let out a short, uncomfortable sound. Not quite a laugh. The nervous release of a man who needed the tension to break, and didn't know any other way to break it. Chairman Yoon turned his head toward him. Just his head. Slowly. He said nothing. Manager Suk went silent so fast it was almost audible. Yoon looked back at Temi. He studied her the way he studied everything, completely, without expression, giving nothing back. The seconds stretched. 10, 15, 20. Then he spoke one sentence to the aide standing to his left. The aide left the room immediately. The aide returned 3 minutes later with a file. A physical file, the original contract documentation. The aide set it on the table in front of Yoon, and Yoon opened it without urgency, without drama, and began to read. The room waited. Temi waited. Nobody spoke. Yoon read for approximately 4 minutes. His face did not change. His posture did not change. The room was so quiet that Temi could hear the paper turning. She watched his eyes move across the pages, steady, methodical, giving nothing back. She did not know what was in the file. She knew only what she had told him. Her sister's name, her sister's age, the name of the man who had handed her a contract in a language she could not fully read and called the clauses she didn't understand formalities. Whether any of that was enough, whether the truth she had carried into this room was sufficient to matter to a man like this, she did not know. She stood still and waited. And then, so subtle that several people in the room likely missed it entirely, his jaw tightened. Just once. Just slightly. The barest contraction of muscle beneath the surface of a face trained over decades to reveal nothing. But it was there. He closed the file. For a moment he was still in the way that men are still when something has genuinely surprised them, and they are deciding what to do with it. Then he looked up, not at manager Suk, at his aide. He asked one question. How old was she when this was signed? The aide checked his own copy of the documentation. 17, Chairman. The number sat in the room like something had been placed on the table that no one wanted to touch. Because here is what those 12 men at that table understood in that moment. What they understood before Yoon said another word. This was not just a moral failure. In Yoon's organization, there were things that were accepted as the cost of operating in the world they operated in. Lines that were treated as negotiable. And then there were lines that were not. lines that Yoon had drawn himself, years ago, with the specific coldness of a man who understood that certain actions created a kind of exposure, legal, reputational, structural, that no amount of management could fully contain. The exploitation of minors was one of those lines. Not because Yoon Sung-hyun was a good man, but because he was a precise one, because he understood that some things, once done, cannot be controlled, cannot be cleaned, cannot be made to disappear regardless of how good your lawyers are. Manager Suk had recruited a 17-year-old girl, had falsified her age on a legal contract, had done it without authorization, without disclosure, without Yoon's knowledge. In that room, at that table, that was not a minor administrative error. That was a man who had made a decision that exposed the entire organization, and had hidden it. Yoon stood. He stood. And the act of him standing, in that room, carried the kind of gravity that a raised voice never could. He walked to the desk against the wall. He picked up the photograph. He carried it back to the table. He set it down in front of Temi and turned it to face her. A young woman, early 20s. The photograph was a few years old. You could tell by the quality of it, the slightly softer color. She was smiling, not posed. Caught mid-laugh, maybe, the way the best photographs catch people, before they knew the camera was there. She had his eyes, the same deep-set, watchful eyes. But where his were guarded, hers were open. Where his gave nothing away, hers gave everything. Temi looked at the photograph. And then she looked up at Yoon. He was already looking at her. "My daughter," he said, quietly, in Korean, and then again in English, because he wanted to be sure she understood every word. "She passed away 6 years ago." A pause. She was 19. No one in that room breathed. Not because they were afraid, though they were, but because something had just happened that none of them had a framework for. They had sat in rooms with this man through negotiations, through confrontations, through moments of genuine danger, and they had never, not once, seen him offer anything personal to anyone. And here he was, standing at the head of his own table, holding a photograph of his daughter, looking at a young woman who was the same age she had been when the world took her from him. In that moment, Chairman Yoon Sung-hyun was not an organization. He was not a reputation. He was not a name that people said quietly in Itaewon. He was a father who had lost his daughter at 19, and who was now looking at a girl who had walked into the most dangerous room in Seoul, with no weapon, no leverage, and no plan, and had not looked away. The silence held, and then Yoon spoke again, and this time the room changed. Temi looked at him across that table. This man who had built a life out of control and distance, and the deliberate suppression of everything that could be used against him. This man whose name was said quietly in her neighborhood, whose photograph of a 19-year-old girl sat on a desk where he could see it at every meeting. She didn't say thank you. She knew that wasn't what this was. She looked at him. This man who had just dismantled in 11 minutes what had taken months to construct, who had produced a photograph from a desk in a room designed to reveal nothing, who had said the word correction when he could have said nothing at all, and she said the only true thing she had left to say. "She had your eyes." The room was completely still. Yoon did not respond immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that 2 of the men at the table exchanged a glance they immediately regretted. Then he looked down at the table. Just once, just briefly. The gesture of a man absorbing something he had not prepared for. When he looked back up, his face had returned to what it always was. Controlled. Exact. But something had shifted in the room's understanding of him. Not in what he showed, but in the fact that for one unguarded second, he had needed to look away. And in a man who had spent 30 years making sure his face was a closed door. That was everything. A correction, not a favor. Temi understood the difference immediately. A favor creates a ledger. A correction simply closes one. What happened next took less than 11 minutes. 11 minutes to undo what Manager Suk had spent months constructing. 11 minutes that Toby, watching through the service hatch without being able to hear, would spend the rest of her life trying to fully understand. 11 minutes that nobody in that room would ever speak about publicly, but that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. Yoon sat back down, but he did not make a speech. He did not deliver a verdict with ceremony or drama. He simply picked up his phone, the one his aide kept charged and within reach at all times. And he made the first call. It lasted 40 seconds. Temi didn't catch every word. Her Korean, precise enough to deliver a case, was not fast enough to follow a man like Yoon speaking to his own legal team at speed. But she heard enough. She heard Toby's name. She heard the word for contract. She heard a term she recognized from the document she'd been studying obsessively for 2 days. The clause number. Clause 7. When he ended the call, he said 2 words to his aide. The aide wrote something down, stood, and left the room. Yoon's instruction was immediate and unambiguous. Toby was released from all obligations that night. She would not return to the restaurant. She would not be contacted. She would not be pursued for the debt. That was the directive, and in his organization, directives did not require follow-up. The formal legal work, the voiding of the contract, the documentation that would hold up to any scrutiny, would be completed within days. But the outcome was decided in that room, in that moment. The debt attached to the contract, every one of those fabricated training fees, was erased, as if it had never existed. Because as far as everyone in that organization was now concerned, it hadn't. The second call was shorter. 30 seconds. Maybe less. Yoon did not look at manager Suk while he made it. He looked at the table. When he finished, he set the phone down and finally turned his gaze toward the man who had been standing against the far wall for the past 15 minutes in the specific stillness of someone who has run through every possible outcome and found none of them acceptable. Yoon did not raise his voice. He said, with the flat precision of a man reading from a document that had already been finalized. You're done. Tonight. Everything. No severance. No transition period. No conversation about it. He stood. In that room, the act of standing was enough. 2 men near the door moved towards Suk without being told. That was the nature of that room. People understood instructions that hadn't been spoken yet. Suk was escorted out with the kind of efficiency that suggested the men doing it had done similar things before and felt nothing particular about doing them again. The men who had helped him, the ones who had processed the falsified paperwork, who had looked at a 17-year-old girl's documentation and written a different number and signed off on it, were contacted in the hours that followed. Each of them received the same message. Gone. Permanent. No exceptions were made. No appeals were entertained. The message being sent inside the organization was not subtle, because Yoon had not intended it to be subtle. When a line that specific gets crossed, the response has to be visible, has to be unambiguous, has to make clear, to everyone watching from every level of that structure, exactly where the boundary is and exactly what happens when someone decides it doesn't apply to them. The third call lasted just over 2 minutes. This one was to his personal lawyer. Not the corporate team, his personal lawyer. A man who had been with Yoon for over 20 years and who understood, when his employer called at this hour with this particular tone, that the matter was both serious and time-sensitive. Yoon instructed him to file a formal complaint related to the recruitment practices tied to that restaurant operation. A complaint that would create a paper trail, that would place the organization, publicly, legally on record, on the opposite side of what Suk had done. It was, in the language of men who operate the way Yoon operated, a form of structural self-protection, a clean separation between the organization and an action it had not sanctioned. But it was also something else. It was a consequence, a real, lasting, official one, filed with bodies that would not ignore it, attached to Suk's name and the names of the men who had helped him in a way that would follow them. Temi understood enough of it to understand what it meant. She stood at the end of that table and felt something shift in her chest. The specific physical sensation of a pressure that has been building for days beginning, slowly, to release. Then Yoon looked at his aide and said simply, "Bring the other one in." Toby came through the door still in her server's uniform. She had watched through the service hatch for 11 minutes without being able to hear. She had watched her sister stand at the head of that table. This girl in a second-hand coat who had somehow found this room, somehow gotten through 2 guard posts, somehow made a man like Chairman Yoon pause mid-sentence and say, "Bring her in." and she had pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the hatch and breathed and watched. She had seen Sook's face change, had seen the aide leave and return with a file, had seen Yoon read it, had seen two men move towards Sook, had watched her sister's shoulders. Those shoulders she knew better than her own, slowly, almost imperceptibly, drop from their position somewhere near her ears. It was that moment, the dropping of Temmie's shoulders, that told Toby it was going to be all right. Before any words, before any instruction to bring her in. Just her sister's body, finally, beginning to unknot. When she came through the door and saw her sister, Temmie crossed the room in 4 steps. They held each other the way people hold each other when they have been genuinely afraid of losing the person in their arms. Not the polished embrace of a reunion. The real thing, gripping, trembling, faces pressed together. The specific desperate relief of two people who share a history so deep that being separated from each other is its own kind of damage. Toby was shaking. Temmie held on tighter. They were still in that coat. Temmie's second-hand coat. The one she'd worn through 2 guard posts and a corridor and a room full of dangerous men. She wrapped it around both of them without thinking. 2 girls. 1 coat. Clinging to each other in a room full of silence. Chairman Yoon watched from the head of the table. He said nothing. He let them have the moment. Then he spoke to his aide quietly. The aide nodded and made a note. Temmie heard her aunt's name. She looked up. Yoon did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the table, the way he looked at things when he was being precise about something. 3 months of treatment, he said. Arranged through a third party. Anonymous. The facility is good. I'm told it's one of the better ones in the city for her condition. A pause. Consider it a correction, he said. Not a favor. 3 months is not a long time. It is not enough time to fully heal. Not enough time to forget. Not enough time to rebuild everything that was taken or repair everything that was broken. 3 months is simply a start, a door that has been opened. The first few steps into a room you weren't sure you'd ever be allowed to enter. But sometimes a start is everything. Mrs. Balogun was not cured. That is the truth of it. Kidney disease at her stage does not simply reverse itself because someone arranged good treatment. The body keeps its own accounting, and hers had been running a deficit for years before anyone knew to look. But she was stable. She was sitting up, eating, arguing with the nurses about the television channel, which, her doctors said privately, was an excellent sign. The woman who had collapsed on the floor of her seamstress shop, who had been carried out on a stretcher while her nieces stood in the doorway unable to do anything, was now reading her Bible in a facility with clean windows and competent staff, and a treatment plan that had been arranged by someone who would never attach his name to it. She didn't know where the funding had come from. Temmie had told her it was a community medical fund, one of the organizations that assists Nigerian diaspora families in Seoul. Mrs. Balogun had accepted this without suspicion because she was a woman who believed, genuinely and without irony, that God moves through people when people allow it. Temmie had let her believe that. Some truths are best carried quietly. Toby went back to school. Not immediately. It took her several weeks before she was ready. There is a particular kind of recovery that has nothing to do with the body, that cannot be measured by a doctor or tracked on a chart, that simply requires time and stillness and the slow, unglamorous work of remembering who you are when no one is trying to tell you otherwise. She took those weeks. She slept. She sat with her aunt. She let Temmie make too much food and talk too much and fill every silence with noise, because that is what Temmie did, had always done, and it turned out that the specific sound of her sister being relentlessly, exhaustingly present was one of the most healing things in the world. Some mornings Toby sat at the kitchen table and did not speak and did not move and simply held a cup of tea until it went cold. Temmie sat with her on those mornings. She did not try to fix it. She understood that some things cannot be fixed. Only sat with, only waited out, only survived one quiet morning at a time until the mornings start to feel like something other than wait. And then one morning, not a dramatic morning, not a morning that announced itself, Toby got up, opened the drawer beside her bed, and took out the notebook. The one she kept under her pillow. The one with the plan, the specific school, the specific program, the specific year. She read through it slowly. Then she picked up a pen and updated it. The partial scholarship came through the same week she re-enrolled. The application had been sitting in a review queue for months, pending, neither approved nor rejected. And then someone reviewed it, and the answer was yes. Toby sat at the kitchen table when the email arrived and read it 3 times before she called Temi. She didn't say anything when Temi picked up. She just started crying. Temi knew immediately. She started crying too. Neither of them said a word for almost a full minute. They didn't need to. Temi found the job through the man who drove the delivery van, the one who had helped her find Yoon's location. His sister worked at a legal aid organization in Itaewon. He mentioned it once. Temi followed up the same day. The organization worked primarily with migrant workers in Itaewon and the surrounding districts. People who had come to Seoul from Nigeria, the Philippines, Indonesia, Bangladesh, a dozen other countries. People who were hard-working and often isolated and frequently handed documents they could not fully read and told that the clauses they didn't understand were formalities. Temi was not a lawyer. She made that clear from the first day, made it clear to every person who sat across from her at that small desk in that small office. She was not a lawyer, she could not give legal advice, she could not represent them in any formal proceeding. What she could do was sit with them and read through a contract line by line and explain, in plain language, exactly what they were being asked to agree to. What she could do was tell them which clauses were standard and which ones were not. What she could do was look them in the eye and say, with the specific authority of someone who had learned this the hard way, through her sister's life and not just through a textbook, this part matters. Do not let anyone tell you it doesn't. She was good at it. She was, it turned out, exceptionally good at it. Not because she was the loudest person in the room or the most formally qualified, but because she was the one who stayed, who read every line, who did not stand up until the person across from her understood what they were signing. That, it turned out, was rarer than any credential. Because she understood something that no law degree teaches. She understood what it costs to have no one in your corner. What it feels like to be in a room where everyone else speaks the language of power, and you are standing there in worn sneakers, trying to make the truth land before someone decides your 30 seconds are up. She understood it because she had lived it, and she was not going to let it happen to anyone else if she could help it. She saw him on a Tuesday evening in late autumn. She was walking back from the office. The long way, the route that took her past the quieter stretch of Itaewon, where the restaurants were smaller and more considered. The kind of places that didn't advertise. The kind of places where the quality of the food spoke for itself, and the lighting was low, and the tables were spaced far enough apart that conversations stayed private. She almost didn't look through the window, but something made her slow down. Some instinct. Some peripheral flicker of recognition she couldn't immediately place. And there he was, Chairman Yoon Sung-hyun, alone at a corner table. No aides. No associates. No file folders or briefings or men in suits waiting to be acknowledged. Just a man at a table in a good coat, with a glass of water he didn't appear to be drinking. And in front of him, a small bouquet of flowers. Nothing elaborate. Something simple and considered. The kind of flowers you bring not to impress but to mark something. To say, I was here. I remembered. His daughter's birthday perhaps. Or the anniversary of a day he could not forget. Temi stood on the pavement outside and looked at him through the glass for just a moment. He didn't see her. He was looking at the flowers. And in his face, in the face of the man whose name was said quietly in her neighborhood, whose organization ran 14 businesses, whose jaw had tightened by exactly 1 degree when he saw what had been done to her sister, there was something that had no place in the stories people told about him. Grief. Ordinary, human, unguarded grief. The kind that doesn't perform itself. The kind that simply sits at a corner table alone and remembers. Temi looked at him for one more moment. Then she pulled her coat around herself and kept walking. Some people change the world by fighting the powerful, by matching force with force, by going to war with the systems and the structures and the men who sit at the heads of tables that cost more than everything they own. Temi didn't fight. She walked into the most dangerous room she had ever entered with nothing. No weapon, no leverage, no plan that any reasonable person would have called a plan. She walked in with the truth about her sister and Korean she had practiced for 6 hours in a bathroom mirror. And somehow, not because the world is fair, because it is not, because it has never been, because the story of two girls sharing one blanket under a lamp in a fourth-floor apartment while the city glittered outside their window is not a story about a fair world. Somehow that was enough. Not because powerful men are secretly good. Not because justice is always waiting to be unlocked if you just say the right words. But because even in the most fortified places, even behind the walls that people spend entire lifetimes constructing around the parts of themselves they cannot afford to lose, something human can still be reached. If you are brave enough to reach for it. Mrs. Balogun is still fighting. Toby is in her second semester. Temi is at her desk in Itaewon, reading through a contract with someone who doesn't speak the language it was written in, pointing to a clause and saying, "This part matters." And somewhere in this city, a man sits alone at a corner table once a year with a small bouquet of flowers, and remembers what it meant to love someone at 19. Would you have walked into that room? No weapon, no plan, no guarantee that anything on the other side of that door was going to go any other way than badly. If you would have, this one was for you. If this story stayed with you, tell me why in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe because there are more people like Temi, more rooms, more decisions, more moments where someone with nothing chose to walk forward anyway. And I intend to find all of them. I'll see you in the next one.